Now witness the firepower of this fully armed and operational PDP. Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. For the last month or so, I've been heads down working on building and restoring a glorious PDP-1183. Over the course of the last year, I've accumulated several partial and several complete systems, and it was time to go through everything, pick the nicest parts from everything I had available, and build the very best PDP-11 system that I could build. But this is truly vintage hardware from before the time of the PC days that most of us are accustomed with. Building this vintage beast isn't just about slapping parts together and then tweaking config.sys, because it's a complex puzzle where each card must be manually configured to avoid clashes and where every slot has its own story to tell. And of course, the hardware is only the first battle. You can boot an image of RT11 or BSD, but it won't support your particular mix of hardware out of the box. We'll need to manually tweak and recompile the kernel at some point for that. So that's what I've been doing for the last month or so, and to be honest, I'm getting pretty good at it now. I feel like I'm a grizzled old veteran PDP hacker compared to the babe in the woods that I started as a few months ago. And all that makes me a little sad because I've learned so much that what the heck am I ever going to do with all this information? Sure, I'll tweak and fix my own machines, but I'm not going to get a job as a retro deck technician wandering the countryside in a van fixing machines, kind of like I wish someone would come and fix the RK05 drives on the big old 1134. And that's when I remembered, I've got a YouTube channel. I can make an episode sharing the good stuff from all the information, and then other people will know a lot more about this stuff, and seeing it come together end to end in 15 minutes will make for an interesting ride. And so that's what I've decided to do. We're going to start with the bare chassis and then add the parts that actually make it a computer, like the CPU, the memory, the disk controllers, serial boards, and so on. I'll take you through the process of turning a pile of parts into a running system. And at each step of the way, we'll encounter the same hurdles that I ran into the first time. For example, how do you get an operating system onto a machine for which you don't have any boot media? Or how do you compile the operating system using the operating system? And at each of those steps, you'll get the satisfaction of finding out what the solution was and sometimes why it took me so long to figure it out. We'll tackle each puzzle individually, and I promise you that the aha moments are worth it, especially when it took me days to figure out some of this stuff. For instance, we'll shock the system to life with a QBone and then pour hot coffee down its throat in the form of a custom build of BSD Unix that we'll have to create ourselves. So buckle up, it's time to turn this ancient pile of boards into a fully functioning PDP-1183 and maybe learn a thing or two in the process. So let's get started. You should always start at the beginning, they say, and for our purposes, the beginning is a blank chassis. The chassis contains the power supply and the backplane, which is the set of slots that go into the case and where all of our boards plug in to connect to one another. Now this is quite different from a desktop PC where you have one board that's the motherboard and then everything else slots into it. The PDP more closely resembles the old IMSI and Altair computers where the CPU and memory are also on cards and plug into the bus just like any other card. Well, that's almost true, because quite often backplanes for the PDP will have special wiring for certain slots where the CPU or memory is expected to live, so those cards have to go into very specific slots, usually the first ones. And so that's the first lesson. The slots are not all equal, as some slots are more equal than others. And now the next thing to get your head around is that in a classic PDP-11, the CPU is not just a chip. In my PDP-1134, it's a complete 6-tab board made up of discrete logic and 4 2901 ALUs. The floating point math is handled by a completely separate plug-in board. And that's for the little 1134. When you get up to the venerable PDP-1170, the CPU is made up of 8 full boards, each of which handles some aspect of the data paths, control logic, microcode, memory management, and so on. And then the floating point hardware occupies another full 5 boards, meaning the processor complex occupies some 13 full boards. So as you can imagine, its backplane is huge. And by the time you add a bunch of serial cards and storage interfaces and floppy controllers and so on, you're bound to fill up that backplane. But the beauty of it is that all you need to do is to rack up another empty backplane right next to it. Then you use a 100-pin ribbon cable pair to connect the last slot of the first backplane to the first slot of the next one, and they can cascade on like that to some maximum of about 16 feet, I think it is. We're going to be working on a PDP-1173, which is roughly equivalent to the power of the big 1170, but from a decade later, so it's been miniaturized down to a single chassis. The CPU is still a full card, but the cache memory and the floating point are now integrated directly onto it. Let's have a look at the chassis. The power supply takes up the rear corner of the machine, and the front is a control panel, and a 5¼ inch drive bay is open for floppies or tape drives, and then there's a fixed bay below that for a hard disk. The rest of the machine is taken up by the backplane area, and that's where the magic happens. We start out with 9 empty slots, and normally the CPU is the first card in the stack, but not today. That's because on this more modern machine, modern being relative, we're going to use a new memory interconnect known as PMI for Private Memory Interconnect. Because having all devices on the bus being able to talk to memory on the bus is great for flexibility, but the bus is kind of slow and the CPU has to wait on it for every single word from RAM. So PMI addresses that by having special wiring on the backplane that gives the CPU a private path directly to the memory without having to go across the main bus. But it does mean that the cards have to go into specific slots, and in this case it's memory first and then the CPU. I'm lucky to have 2 of the PMI memory boards, and each is a whopping 2 megabytes, which means we'll actually hit the maximum 4 megabytes that can be addressed on the 22-bit memory bus. And so we'll install 2 memory boards, followed by the CPU board. The CPU then gets connected to the case by 2 small ribbon cables, one for connecting to the case's front panel, and the other for a serial console connection. That one goes to a header on the back of the case, which has a rotary knob that allows us to select baud rates up to 38400. Now, I'm using an authentic VT220 terminal for communicating with the system, and it's limited to 19.2, so I'll set the rotary knob to read 1, and that should be the setting we need. When we power on the machine, if all goes well, we should receive a banner that the PDP-11 CPU board has started its power on self-tests, which proceeds immediately into a 9-step memory test. With 4 megabytes of RAM installed, it can take a while, but it's a lot faster than an old IBM PC's memory test, that's for sure. When the memory test is complete, we're dropped into a text menu system for the PDP-11's boot environment. If we type map, we get a dump of the system memory map, and it shows our 4 megabytes of memory active and connected by the special PMI interface rather than QBUS, so that's how we want it. This all confirms that the CPU and RAM is working properly, and so with that, it's time to start adding some other hardware into the system in the form of serial boards, disk controllers, Ethernet, and more. Expansion boards come in 2 main flavors: full-width 4-tab cards and half-width 2-tab cards. Now, everything so far has been a full-width board, but when you start to include half-width cards, another factor comes into play for the QBUS: the bus grant lines. You see, the bus supports DMA, which means a device can take over the bus and start writing directly to memory. So when it's reading a sector off disk, the CPU is not only spared from having to do the work, it's also free to do other things. And the disk controller can deposit the results of the sector directly into memory and then just notify the CPU that it's ready. But like the Highlander, though, when it comes to bus masters, there can be only one.
There can be only one.
How does the system handle this, or in fancier terms, what is its bus arbitration scheme? Well, the bus carries a signal line called the bus grant line, and it winds slot to slot. Each card that's plugged in has the option of just passing that signal along to the next slot, or adding circuitry to intercept the grant line when it's active and take advantage of being the bus master. So when the CPU decides that the time is right, it enables the bus grant line. That signal then goes to the first card, and then onto the second card, and so on. Let's say the third card is a disk controller, and it now wants to do DMA. When it sees the bus grant line go high, it does not just pass it along. It now intercepts it and starts to do its DMA until it's either done or the DMA grant line gets turned off upstream. When it's done, it no longer needs the bus grant, and so it passes it along to the next card in the chain. But what would happen if you shut the machine down and you had 4 full slots full and you pulled the third card out, leaving that slot empty? Who would be there to pass the grant signal along for that slot? And the answer is no one, which is why you can't leave empty slots in the middle of your card stack. On the older Unibus machines, it was even more complicated because you had to install a bus terminator right after your last card. And to make it just that much more spicy, some backplanes, like the one in my PDP-1134, are wired with these grant signal jumpered across the slot from the factory. And that means you have to cut or unwrap the jumpers on any slots where you plan to install a card that wants to do DMA, and doing so was one of the most pucker-inducing things I've ever done with a computer. But by the QBUS days of our PDP-1173, the backplane is self-terminating. And so that simplifies things substantially, but it still has the grant chain, and so you can't leave empty slots along the way. In fact, if you want to remove a card temporarily without shifting everything else up, you must plug in what's known as a grant card, whose only real job is to pass along the grant signal to the next slot. Of course, I didn't know any of this either. Each bit of knowledge was gained after some painful experience with the machine not booting or the run light not working or refusing to go off or whatever. Then I'd ask on the forums and read the docs until I had some kind of epiphany and get through the issue and then run right into the next one. But with the system booting up to the menus, it was time to add the rest of our hardware. First to go in this case is an M3104 8-port serial multiplexer, which allows up to 8 more terminals to be connected to the system, and not counting telnet connections, which are separate. We're going to want to connect a real hard drive to this machine, and so that's where the RQDX3 controller enters the picture. It's a half-width card with a proprietary ribbon cable connector. That ribbon cable connects internally to a distribution block that splits the signals into 2 sets of ST506 style MFM hard drive cables and a floppy cable. I didn't appreciate why initially, but it does eliminate a great deal of cable mess inside the machine, as only a single cable winds up going to the controller itself. Next up is networking. We're going to drag our PDP kicking and screaming into the late 90s by giving it access to the web, and that requires Ethernet, so I'll be adding another half-width card, a DEC M7504 Ethernet adapter. It was originally intended for the coaxial style of Ethernet, and so it has what's known as an AUI port. It looks like the same 15-pin connector as a game port, but don't try plugging a joystick into it. I'll be using an AUI to RJ45 converter that allows me to plug a regular twisted pair cable into the PDP and then connect it to the switch. Now remember, this isn't 10 gigabit or even gigabit. It's not even 100 megabit. It's not fast Ethernet. It's just plain old original Ethernet, which is 10 megabits per second. And if that seems slow, rest assured that a PDP-11 can't come anywhere near saturating a 10 megabit pipe anyway. My first discovery was that my unified desktop switch, a 10 gigabit unit, wouldn't link up with the PDP's Ethernet at all. So I dragged out an old blue Linksys 100 meg switch, and that worked. So as a compromise, I tried a small 4-port gigabit switch from Unify, and that seems to be working. With the M7504 card, however, I'm seeing up to 30% packet loss, something I don't see when trying a 7516 card, which is a bit newer. It even has a 68000 chip on the actual network card, which is probably more powerful than the PDP itself, but hey, that was the architecture of the late 90s. I have to go back and try the Linksys again to see what happens, and I haven't had a chance to do so yet. Next, I'll also mount an original DEC RD52 full-height 40 megabyte hard drive in the main bay, and in this case, it's really a rebranded Quantum 540 hard drive. But now we're in a real chicken and egg situation. We need to low-level format the drive, but we don't have a way to boot the system into the diagnostics package that's needed to do it. In the old days, some guy with a gray beard much longer than mine would ride in on his motorcycle and boot the machine from paper tape, or maybe even magnetic tape in later days. Well, I don't have a paper tape reader, nor do I have the tapes needed anyway, so that's not going to help me. And that's where the QBone rides to the rescue. It's a full-width QBUS card that you plug into the bus like any other card. But it's a card that holds a secret in the form of a BeagleBone single-board computer. Now, a BeagleBone is like a Raspberry Pi, except it likes its toast done on one side. But either way, the BeagleBone has an SD card slot, and it can present images from that SD card on the bus as if they were actual DEC hard drives. So the QBone emulates the device itself at the interface bus level, and it's just as if a real device were plugged into that slot. It's a bit of magic, and it will allow us to mount an image of the DEC XXDP diagnostics. To do so, I'll install the QBone as the last card in the stack, which I can do because with exactly 2 half-width cards, I have no half-full rows. Putting the QBone last is also important because it's physically thicker than all the rest of the cards, and so you also need to insert a piece of cardboard in between the QBone and the next card up, lest they contact and kill each other. Ask me how I know. Once the QBone is installed, we'll turn the machine on and find that nothing has yet changed. It doesn't just magically boot, but that's because the QBone, or more accurately the BeagleBone on the QBone, is still booting itself. And it will take about a minute to come up, and then we can SSH into it from the local LAN to connect to the BeagleBone inside the PDP. Once we're in, we launch a script that mounts the disk image that we care about. The script then also cycles power on the QBUS, which will cause the whole machine to reset. And so about 90 seconds after you turn it on, the QBone will add its virtual drive to the system and then reboot the bus. From that point forward, the virtual drive will be visible, and we can even boot from it. It's the newer one that we want, so we'll enter boot DL1 and the system will promptly boot from the disk image that we supplied. Once we get into the XXDP command prompt, we can enter the name of the diag program that we wish to execute, which in this case is the RQDX3 disk formatting program known as ZRQC. When we do so, we'll be asked to confirm or supply the specifics on the controller, like what address it lives at, which unit we're going to format, and how to handle bad blocks, and so on. For me, I found the best options here were to not use the auto format mode, to try to get the manufacturer disk information for bad blocks from the drive, but then not fail if that's not present. Answering the questions that way got me through the format, usually, or sometimes. I say sometimes because I had a small collection of ST506 drives that I'd collected over the years, and a few recent ones that I'd picked up on eBay. And long story short, about 1 in 4 turns out to be actually usable. So I've ordered a couple of ST4096 drives so that I can standardize on that geometry. I'd like to get a couple more of them, so if you've got a Seagate ST4096 REN drive to donate to the cause, please reach out. Same thing for DEC SDI drives like the RA73, I'm always on the lookout for those. And the crazy cables that they need to connect them. But I digress. Because our next steps will be to bring up the system in a real operating system like BSD, partition the drive, get a file system on it, and ultimately boot from it before we custom build our BSD kernel to match the hardware we've installed. But I'm out of time for today, so if you want to know how this one ends, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss the next thrilling follow-up episode. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like on this video, and I do try to read all the comments, so fire away in the comments. And speaking of comments, be sure not to miss our new podcast called Shop Talk on the Dave's Attic channel, where we address the best user questions from the video comments every week. Check it out at the link in the video description, where I think you'll enjoy it. Thanks for joining me out here in the shop today. In the meantime and in between time, I hope to see you next time, right here in Dave's Garage.